we were playing in Nottingham, and then next door was Jim Davidson performing. And so at the end, we went back to the hotel and we were having a party because we were number one that day, you know. And of course, Jim Davidson gate crashes with Les Dawson. And
well, that's marginally better than Jim, I guess.
And we couldn't get them out. They were both trolleyed. And I think they were our bouncers. Probably, you know, they were the last people to be chivied out. I remember Les Dawson rolling around.
It just made me laugh, Gary, because you know, someone who bought that album at the time, absolutely worshipped you at the time, but to know that such a celebration was savaged by Les Dawson,
savaged,
and Jim
besmirched.
Davidson. Do you want to start by telling us the exciting thing that is happening tomorrow?
Right. So let me just take you back first of all, because on the 29th of August 1976, 3 punk bands played at the Screen on the Green in Islington, where I grew up in Islington. And I was fortunate enough to go to this gig as a 16-year-old. There's a bit of a long story. It's to do with this wonderful guy, Stephen Woolley, who is a producer for Palace Pictures, and he's in Cannes as we speak. He left school early, he loved film so much, and he went and became the assistant manager at the Screen on the Green in Islington. And via him, me and some friends found out that the Sex Pistols, who were kind of talked about a little bit, but not much, were playing there at midnight with 2 other bands on that date. And it changed my life, as it did a lot of other people. And when we do the podcast show, normally we talk about this a lot, this event that Guy, my fellow podcastee, didn't go to. So it's become a source of ribbing.
Why couldn't he go?
Because, well, unfortunately...
Did his mum not let him out?
Unfortunately, he's 2 years younger than me, and maybe he wasn't quite there at the time. And it was also just one of those, I was lucky to be in the right place at the right time. So tomorrow night, as part of the podcast festival, Guy and I are taking our podcast, Raconteurs, live to the Screen on the Green to rub his nose in it even more. And we're going to be interviewing 2 people, both of whom played on stage that night nearly 50 years ago, Steve Diggle from the Buzzcocks and Glenn Matlock from the Sex Pistols.
Take us back to that night in 1976. Why did it change your life?
Well, you know, up until that point, you know, I was playing in a band. I was playing in a band with a lot of people a lot older than me, maybe 30-year-old people, that I'm 15, 16. The scene in London was pub rock, and that seemed to be in awe of Laurel Canyon. It was double denim and Americana, and there were a lot of bands just playing that kind of music, and that is the kind of music I was playing with these guys who were nearly 30. It came along and kind of blew that out of the water. What I saw that night was quite extraordinary. The Buzzcocks and the Clash and the Pistols had an art about them, an archness about them, cleverness, but a rawness, and the music was for a 16-year-old, it was just incredible to hear. It was like everything that I loved about Bowie, plus Iggy Pop and the Stooges and all of that stuff. Plus it was arty. You know, I remember the Clash having their legs wide apart, standing in boiler suits with splashed paint all up and down, you know, like a Jackson Pollock. So it was a great night.
But what you went on to do with Spandau Ballet, it wasn't like that, was it?
Do you know what? It's not far off, really, because I went straight back the week after, met those guys from in my band and said, I'm leaving. Another friend who was with me that night was Steve Norman.
Right.
Who went on to be in Spandau Ballet as well. We went straight into school the week after, when new term started, went straight to the music room and set up our amps and tried to play like the Pistols and the Clash. And that was when Tony Hadley came in and sang, and John Keeble, and we formed Spandau. Now, what makes it similar is that a lot of the people that were in the Blitz Club that began the whole new romantic scene in London were also at those early punk gigs. And I think in many ways, Malcolm McLaren's formula of how to break a band and to be the house band of a particular new youth cult movement, we took that all on board when we were starting Spandau.
And have many people over the years come up to you and been able to describe going to one of your gigs in the same delicious way as giving them permission to release something of themselves that they might not have had before?
Well, I think, those early gigs we played at the Blitz were quite extraordinary sort of events to be out, or on the HMS Belfast when we did that. Yeah, I mean, so many bands sprung out in the 80s based on a handful of bands, Arsene Duran, ABC up in Sheffield, the Human League. There was a zeitgeist that was happening in 1980 when it was our turn to be the next movement, if you like. And yeah, I think that was the case.
I was a really nerdy teenager in Liverpool, Gary, and I used to read about you in The Face. And there was real exclusivity about you. Clubs like the Blitz with terrifying people like Steve Strange on the door. And I used to sit there and just think, well, what are my chances if I can't get into places like that? I'll never be fashionable enough.
But look where you've got to.
And look at me now. No, but did you understand? Because I know I appreciate you're from working class backgrounds and all the rest of it, but there was a real exclusivity about
I think there was with the punk scene as well. It was quite, to see the Sex Pistols was not easy, and to find out where they were playing and all of that sort of stuff. But I think mystique and mythology is what you're creating right at the beginning. And that's what people kind of desire. If they can't get in through the door, they want it more. But that can't last for long. We wanted to be successful. We wanted to sell singles. We quickly wanted to get out of that and into a record company and and have people like yourself come to the shows.
Just break it to me gently, Gary. And I did in the end, by the way, see you live. So that's all right.
Yeah, but I think, before the internet, as we all know, it was all done on, people going into phone boxes and saying, have you heard, is there something going on at such and such a house or such and such a club? And I think that was the thrill, that sort of detective work that you had to do to find out who was coming to your show.
So do you ever wonder about how you would have fared in those early years of Spandau Ballet if it was now, if you were born of the TikTok generation and the streaming generation?
I think it's much harder to retain any mystique. I think if mobile phones were around at the time when we first started playing, someone would have filmed it, put it on YouTube, and someone would have commented underneath saying rubbish. And that would have kind of been it. So I think not revealing oneself is part of the thrill. But of course, nowadays we live in a time when everyone wants to reveal everything about themselves. There's nothing. So I think I can't tell you how to break a band now. It's
and it's a weird one, isn't it? Because actually, I can't think of a enormous kind of superstar who's been born, into the music industry. I don't mean literally born, in the last kind of, 5 or 10 years.
No, there hasn't been.
And that's something to do with the proliferation, I think.
Well, it's also the dominance of America at the moment, musically. Because in my lifetime, this is the first time it's really happened, where American acts are the biggest acts in the world, and
they're so huge, aren't they?
Yeah, so I think it's much. I've no idea how, but it's much trickier. Most of the big acts, English acts that I can think of, British acts, they've been around a while. There isn't that, and I think people have their own profile, don't they? They have everyone can be the star they want to be on Instagram or whatever it might be, Facebook, but it's. And you have your own profile page, and you can put your own filters on, and you can make yourself the star you want to be. And you don't have to learn an instrument, So you don't have to find other people, like-minded people. And I think the reason those kind of waves of youth culture kept on coming. I mean, my dad was a teddy boy, and then there were mods. I used to watch them outside my window because they all went to the pub next door to where we lived, and and then there were the sort of psychedelic kids, and those waves of youth culture that has stopped. I don't see that anymore. But that was to have a uniform that you could say, "Hey, I'm over here. I'm in your gang. Let's get together and do something."
There will be people listening who don't remember what Spandau Ballet used to look like, and I can't remember which one of you used to wear the tartan throw.
That's my brother.
That was Martin. Yeah. Okay, but who did that styling for you, or was it all from you?
No, it was all from us. We went to the Blitz Club, which was this tiny little club, and it was full of kids who had very little money, and it was basically Steve Strange and Rusty Egan who arranged it on a Tuesday night, because that was the worst night of the week in any club, and the club owner was quite willing to have at least a few people in. A lot of them were from St Martin's School of Design, doing fashion. So those some of those kids made stuff for us to wear. But we were all going into, junk shops and into Army and Navy stores and to looking for anything we could find that would make us look different and be different on the street. That's what we really wanted to do. We wanted to be looked at, didn't we? Like those kids who have posh Instagram sites.
Yeah, I guess that's
and
true.
it was a beautiful site, wouldn't you?
No, I mean, they were. You really
Yeah.
stood out. I mean,
You did.
Not to sort of make it sound like old farts corner, but streaming is a bit of a nuisance if you're our generation. Top of the Pops was a massive, massive point in the week at which, because there was only ever one telly in the house, you'd all gather and your dad would make really sarky remarks about this. Look at the state of him, and you and your brother with your funny clothes and all sorts of attitude. It was but it was such a big point in the week.
Well,
for
it was,
everybody.
and I think we wanted to make a seminal appearance on Top of the Pops because we knew that, my life had changed when I saw Bowie do Starman on Top of the Pops.
Yeah.
And I never forget it to this day, and I can still feel the goosebumps. It was an extraordinary moment, and I think everyone wants that moment when they first get on Top of the Pops. Maybe Adam Ant had that to a certain extent, and we wanted to do that as well. So, because your granny knew what was number one, didn't she?
Yeah.
Everybody, that was the centre of culture, certainly of pop culture. I don't think my nan's not alive now, but she would not know what number one was.
No.
Well, she could have a good guess. She could say Ed Sheeran and pretty much get it right.
I don't know what number one
Some
is.
territory should be right, wouldn't she? Can we spool forward to the now? Tell us a little bit about the podcast that you do with Guy. I mean, it is deliciously nerdy, but the detail involved in your conversations to anybody who loves music is absolutely delicious.
I think it's fundamentally about our friendship because we've known each other for a long time and we have quite a strong sense of humour, and if we can bring that out, that's good. And it basically began when we both play in Nick Mason's band. Nick Mason from Pink Floyd, he's called Nick Mason, Source Full of Secrets, and we've been playing for the last 5 years with him. And we were on tour back in, 2019, and we were watching Old Grey Whistle Test DVD, all the greatest hits of the Old Grey Whistle Test, which is fairly nerdy stuff. Let's get
said it.
What facts do we know about Jethro Tull? Well, actually, I do know some facts. And so we would banter stuff around, and it was we'd have a few jokes about it, and someone in the old days people would say, "You two get a room." Now they say, "You two get a podcast."
It's very true. Look what happened.
Yeah, dangerous stuff though.
So Guy said, "Why don't we try to do this on air? We know a few people. We have a little phone book of our musicians, and we could start to go through that and see what it looks like." So the first one was Nick Mason. Of course, he had to be, really.
Who have you enjoyed shooting the breeze with the most?
Johnny Marr's great. He has a very similar story, but obviously set up in Manchester. And same as Noel is also very much into music and very good and expansive about where things started or came from. Everyone from Hank Marvin to Mick Fleetwood. Mick Fleetwood was actually really touching, because I think something we do, being musicians and not journalists, is we can disarm people, and it becomes like a sort of AAA backstage gathering. And Mick, towards the end of the interview, ended up welling up and becoming very tearful and saying the only thing he really wants at that point is to get Lindsey Buckingham and the whole band back on stage one more time, because Lindsey had left at that time. Unfortunately, since then, Chrissy has died. But
they did manage to get back.
Not since that interview.
No, not since then.
No. So,
Okay.
and I think, we had Roland Orzabal on, who was very honest about his tricky relationship with his musical partner.
That's Tears for Fears.
Thank you very Tears for Fears. And it was, I think we're not trying to fox people, but I think, they know we're musicians, and they know that, I've had tricky relationships with my musical partners. We can relate to each other. So some things like that come out, and we've never once had anyone phone up afterwards and say, take that out.
But you were the songwriter in Spandau Ballet. I mean, they couldn't have existed without you. So the responsibility fell to you, didn't it? And there must have been times where you thought, I've got nothing in the locker here. I can't. This isn't working. Well, I mean, the pressure must have been at times quite tremendous.
Yeah, no, I did feel that. You feel that not so. Well, I remember once at our second album, and we'd had a string of hits, and then we released a song, and it didn't make top 40. I remember being at an airport when our manager told me, it's not going to get in the top 40, this track. And I just thought, what am I going to do now? Because these guys are relying on me, and it's my fault that it's not got in the top 40 because the song isn't good enough. I went away and I decided not to chase any sort of club music or try and do things based on the latest groove, and I wrote the True album. Then, after that, you have even more sense of concern because you think, well, how do I compete with myself with that? I've got to write another one of those. But, I was young and it it seemed to, it worked for quite a while. And then I think in the end, you do get a little bit frustrated by this. After 10 years, things you will never be the latest and the most favourite band, and at that time I think the DJ scene was coming in and it was time for us to move along.
And do you think that you do still have a lot of good songs in you somewhere? I was listening to Paul Simon's 7 Psalms on the way into work today. I mean, he's written that. He's, 81 now. And it's beautiful music. It's incredibly sad.
Is it? Oh, dear.
Yes, and it really does. It does feel like you're listening to somebody's kind of amen, actually. But I did think, God, as a body of work, that's just extraordinary.
Well, it's what you need from him then, Yeah. I had a solo album out 2 years ago, and I was really happy. It made Album of the Week on Radio 2. It didn't make the charts. Well, it didn't make the top 40 just. It did make the top 40. It made the top 10 when it was on record sales, but as soon as the streaming comes in, of course, you're just batted down.
Let's call it a top 10 hit.
Yeah,
I call it amongst friends here. But does that have to matter to you anymore? Because you've been such an enormous success in terms of the figures and the stats and whatever.
No, it doesn't matter. You want communication, though. You want the more people to listen to what you've done. And so I'm writing from the perspective of a bloke who's 60 years old, at that point, and so it's only going to appeal to people of that generation, I think. And for Paul Simon, by the way, there's quite a funny story when I met Paul, and he was talking about songwriting, and he was going to tell me how he comes up with his titles, and he said he was in a Chinese restaurant because he used to live a lot in London in the 60s and 70s. And he was in a Chinese restaurant in London, and he was looking down the menu at all the different meals, wondering what to choose. And one was chicken and egg, and it was called Mother and Child Reunion. And he thought that'd be a good title.
That's where he got the title from.
That's exactly where he got the title from. Or so he told me.
Unbelievable.
Superb.
I know that you are a great songwriter, but True is the song that everybody knows. And you must be conscious of the fact the number of teenagers who will have had their first snog to True in the 1980s, and possibly even more than a snog to that song. It was just there at every single event I went to, played towards the end of the evening by whoever was in charge of the music.
Yeah. Yeah, I am aware of that because people often tell me that. Taxi drivers might tell me that, or a plumber might tell me that. In fact, Kevin Costner actually even told me.
Kevin Costner
told me
okay.
that True was his song and it belonged to him and his wife. They're divorced now, so obviously they have he has a different song now. Probably. But I think that's that is true. There was a wedding song that it was used in The Wedding Singer. As a wedding song, it's a funny tune actually because lyrically it's about not getting someone. It's about wanting to admit that you love someone or that you're attracted to someone, but you don't quite want them to know that. And why do I find it hard to write the next line when I want the truth to be said? Is what it's about. But it becomes a song because people like the music, I guess.
They're not listening to the words,
Really
Gary. That's so frustrating.
It's like Every Breath You Take is a wedding song. It's a stalker song.
Yeah, it's awful.
Have you ever made your love on Wasteland?
From Through the Barricades, yeah. How do you answer that?
Actually, I was
I
going to
think
ask.
he has.
I think he might have done. I don't think there have been many songs written about Northern Ireland, and I would say that was it's about the only one
Belfast
I can
Boy.
think of.
Belfast Boy.
Belfast Boy.
Simple-
Okay, yeah.
Simple Minds.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. I'd had an experience where the drummer Jim from Stiff Little Fingers, his brother had worked with us on merchandise in the early '80s, and his brother was actually killed by a soldier in Northern Ireland. And when we visited Belfast, he took me to see his grave, and on the way there, obviously, we passed through that divide between the Falls Road and I'm forgetting the name of the other road, but the divide between the communities, the two distinct communities of Belfast at that time in the mid '80s. And I saw the barricades, and you'd be quite shocked when you went and arrived in Belfast. The military turrets,
Up in the murals,
and the tanks, and so when I got to the end of that experience, I felt that I really wanted to put something down in music about a kind of Romeo and Juliet situation within Belfast, and I don't think there's anything specific in there that says it's about Belfast. I mean, it says a terrible beauty in there, which is obviously Maud Gonne, Yeats' phrase, But other than that, I remember going to Belfast, to Berlin in the 1990 tour, 89, and we were walking towards the wall, and we could hear what I thought were birds chirping. Now, actually, they were chisels on the wall, and we got there, and we got a chisel and a hammer, and we were all banging away. And I remember creating a hole in the wall, and the soldier from East Berlin's head coming through, and people driving around in trabans looking at the West Berlin. And we played that song that night in Berlin, and it had a resonance.
If we've got time, you couldn't quickly retell the story of who ends up turning up at the party you had in Nottingham to celebrate True getting to number one. It's in an episode of your podcast that I listened to.
Yeah. We were playing in Nottingham, and then next door was Jim Davidson performing. And so at the end, we went back to the hotel, and we were having a party because we were number one that day, and of course, Jim Davidson gate crashes with Les Dawson, and
Well, that's marginally better than Jim, I guess.
and we couldn't get them out. They were both trolleyed. And I think they were our bouncers. Probably, they were the last people to be chivied out. I remember Les Dawson rolling around.
It just made me laugh, Gary, because someone who bought that album at the time, absolutely worshipped you at the time. The idea now, I mean, it's lovely to meet you. Actually, that's a personal highlight for me. But to know that such a celebration was savaged by Les Dawson.
Savaged,
and Jim
besmirched.
Davidson. Besmirched, yeah. It's a wonderful detail. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. It's really, really nice to see you.
Thank you for having me.
for all of the rock chat.